On occasion, the U-boats themselves give aid to the survivors. Those in convoy stand a good chance of being picked up. For others, the perils and hardships of open boats. A merchant Navy officer who sailed in 12 Atlantic convoys is John Harvey.
Well, the nights were on balance more dangerous than the day. Most of the U-boat attacks or air attacks, if you were near enough to the coast, seemed to come at night. But you had to get used to these things. You slept according to the cargo you carried. I remember particularly that if you were carrying a cargo of, say, iron ore, you knew that if the ship was torpedoed, it would go down in about 20 seconds. So you slept fully clothed, your cabin door wedged open, a life jacket alongside you, and you hoped that if there was an explosion, you'd be able to rush out on deck before the ship went under. If you were carrying high explosives, you got into your pajamas, closed your cabin door, and had a normal night's sleep. And if you were still there in the morning, you hadn't been torpedoed.
He recalls one dramatic episode.
I think in many ways, it was when I saw a little corvette, the Speedwell, blown out of the water right in front of my own ship. And we had to sail through a handful of survivors in the water crying for help. And of course, in convoy, you couldn't do anything else. You had to go on your way. Otherwise, you would endanger ships behind you. And you merely hoped that one of the other escort vessels managed later on to save some of these men.
It was usually the task of the escort ships to pick up survivors, and often it was necessary to haul aboard those who were unable to climb the scrambling nets or struggle free from the sea itself. For the merchant seamen, it wasn't so much the fear of sudden death that haunted them, but slow death in oil-choked water, or the unknown hours of cold, exposure, hunger, and, ironically, thirst. The convoy system is the only sure defense against the U-boat wolf packs. This method calls for the highest degree of team spirit and discipline from the merchant seaman, two qualities abundant in the British character. But it also takes courage and patience to plod for day after day from one side of the ocean to the other, from the tip of Ireland to the tip of Newfoundland, at the disheartening speed of 7 knots. A convoy is an immense floating target of 10 or more columns of 4 or 5 ships, each 500 yards apart, altogether some 6 miles wide, a mile or more long. Sailors of the Royal Navy shared the dangers and fatigue of convoy duty with the merchant seamen, plus one extra bounty, the traditional rum issue. That autumn was a disastrous time for Allied merchant shipping in the Atlantic. One convoy that left Newfoundland in October 1940 with 35 ships arrived in Britain with only 14. 21 were sunk by U-boats on the crossing. Certainly a record loss, but many convoys lost 20% of their number. "28 years later, the head of Churchill's Department of Anti-Submarine Warfare, Rear Admiral Howard Johnston, has not forgotten those events.
At first, a few submarine captains were very successful in this area, while all our forces were employed on anti-invasion duties. However, early in 1941, our forces became stronger, and we were able to escort further into the Atlantic. The submarines moved further out to a gap which was beyond the 600 miles from Iceland, England, and Newfoundland, and operated in that area. At that time, in 1941, the enemy started concentrating their U-boats in packs on the surface. The first U-boat to gain contact with a convoy called up the others of his team, and they attempted to get ahead of the convoy and attack it. We had a limited number of escorts at that time, but new construction was coming along. The Royal Canadian Navy was in action from St. John's, and towards the end of 1941, in spite of very heavy losses, it seemed as though we might be able to hold our own.
Aboard the battleship Prince of Wales, Churchill and Roosevelt meet in August 1941 to agree on the objectives of the war. The United States has not yet entered the conflict, but it's not neutral. The conference is known as the Atlantic Meeting. The United States has already lent 50 old destroyers to Britain against a 99-year lease of bases in Newfoundland and the Caribbean. During 1940, escorts had averaged only 2 per convoy. By 1941, more are now available, but still far too few to beat off the wolf packs. Thanks to ASDIC, a submarine detection system invented in the 1914-18 war, the naval escorts can detect and locate a submerged U-boat within the radius of a mile. Running in towards it, the moment can be calculated when the U-boat is directly beneath. This is the moment to release depth charges set to explode at different levels. Shaken by these salvos of depth charges, the U-boat has only one method of escaping: diving. Diving always deeper, beneath the explosions, until the crew hears the cracking of the ship's plates.
In the spring of 1941, the escorts strike back against the U-boats. Between March and October, they sink 17. It is the end of the happy time, the end of the aces. In March, 2 of Admiral Donitz's young wolves, Preen and Shepka, are sent to the bottom in full view of their comrade Kretschmer.
Half an hour later, my U-boat followed that of Shepka's to the bottom of the Atlantic. Altogether, the 2 of us had managed to sink 1,300,000 tons of shipping. I was sunk south of Iceland by the destroyer Walker, part of the escort group of the famous commander Donald McIntyre. Today, he is a friend of mine, and some years ago returned to me my binoculars taken from me that day in 1941.
The German admirals then planned to bring out their surface ships. The Bismarck, a monster of 40,000 tons, mounting 8 15-inch guns, believed to be unsinkable. receives sailing orders in May 1941 to make for the open Atlantic. In company with the cruiser Prince Eugen, it leaves its Norwegian port and makes a great detour by the north of Iceland and near to polar waters. It emerges in the North Atlantic, but the Royal Navy is waiting. The heavy guns of the Bismarck prove devastating. After only a few minutes, the battlecruiser Hood blows up from a direct hit and sinks almost instantly.
That night, the carrier Victorious flies off her old Swordfish aircraft into the stormy darkness. A torpedo hits the Bismarck's armored hull. Trailing oil, she's forced to make for the port of Brest. The British fleet loses touch with her, and she nearly escapes. In the nick of time, Swordfish from the Ark Royal cripple her with a torpedo hit which jams the battleship's rudder. The following day sees the Hood avenged, as the home fleet's battleships and cruisers arrive under the command of Admiral Tubby. Despite the 14 and 15-inch guns of the King George V and Rodney, 3 more torpedoes from the cruiser Dorsetshire were finally required to finish off the German battleship.
The Germans now use another weapon against convoys, the aeroplane. They have modified for the purpose a 4-engined commercial airliner into a bomber with very long range, called the Condor. At first, these bombers, based at Bordeaux-Mérignac, scored many successes over the Atlantic.